This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. If you love brewing as much as we do and are inspired by the work of leading commercial brewers like Mitch Steele of New Realm, Tommy Arthur of Lost Abbey, Matt Brindleson of Firestone Walker, Jeff Stuffings and Avery Swanson of Jester King, Jason Perkins of Allagash, and more, then put one of our 2018 Brewers Retreat events on your calendar. These luxury brewing events at gorgeous resort locations around the country pair great brewers, great food, and intimate camaraderie for a truly unique and unforgettable experience. Learn more at brewersretreat.com. And if you're interested in reaching the thousands of listeners who tune into every episode of the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast, we'd love to welcome you as a sponsor. For more information, drop an email to info@beerandbrewing.com, and our media sales team will craft a plan that works for you. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner, co-founder and editor of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, and my guests today are James and Sarah Howat of Black Project Spontaneous and Wild Ales. You may know Black Project from the 3 GABF medals they've won. You may know them from their number 32 spot on Best Breweries in the World on Untapped. You may have tasted some of their spontaneous beer made with significant amounts of fruit, or brewed here and spontaneously fermented in their urban Denver, Colorado location. And if you haven't, you should get some as soon as you can. Welcome, James and Sarah, to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast.
Hi there.
Hi.
So tell me a little bit about the start of this brewery. Last time I was here was probably 2015, and it was a brewery under another name, Former Future, with a much more, how should I say, a common tap list. It was more in line with what other breweries typically launch with. You all have since that time made a pretty significant shift in moving the brewery in a completely different direction.
Yeah. So we opened Former Future in February 2014. And it was, that was our original model, was just it was supposed to be like sort of new interpretations of historical styles. And as part of that, we did not really a lot of sour beers. We did IPAs and porters and stuff, and we knew we wanted our sour beer program to be based on spontaneous fermentation. And we did a Kickstarter before we opened, and we were going to get a cool ship right up front and a bunch of barrels. And due to kind of switching the rules around at the last minute with the Kickstarter, we didn't fund it. And so we just sort of did it like on a very small scale. We basically bought these 2 stock pots that were 120 gallons total and put those on the roof and used those as our cool ship. And we bought barrels here and there, like taking money out of the register to buy a barrel here or there. Luckily, our brewing size is very small, so we do a 4-barrel turn basically. And so, 2 oak barrels were great because that was one whole batch, and it's not that expensive to fund that. So we started brewing spontaneous stuff right around the time we were first opening Former Future. The first one wasn't ready until August of that year, so 8 months later. And when we went to release that, a lot of our staff didn't really know we had even been doing this, and so that's sort of where the name Black Project came from. Is it was this sort of like top secret thing in the back that I didn't even know if it was going to be working or be any good at all. And there was no point in publicizing about us doing it because it might have sucked, and there's no point until you can taste it. So we called it Black Project, and we entered that beer into JBF and won a medal. And then from there we started brewing more and more of it, but brewing and having more and more of them ready. And so we were trying to work up to bottle releases once a month, and it never really got to once a month, but got close. And then about, I guess it would be 2 years later, in August of 2016, we realized we got some more space next door and put a whole bunch of barrels in there that were full of beer, and we decided, hey, if we stopped making these clean beers and sort of stopped spending our efforts on making salted caramel porter, then we could have a Black Project tap room all the time, and so that's what we decided to do. So yeah.
What were your influences early on that made you say, let's make spontaneous beer? I think I can make something along those lines. What else were you drinking, and what were you inspired by to make that giant leap?
Yeah, I mean, the only beer I had really had that was spontaneous to that point was Goose and Lambic. And I liked those beers a lot, and that was something I wanted to try and do, sort of what they did, and see how it would be here in Denver, and then also sort of taking the start of what they do, and then what if you experiment out and do very different things in some ways than how they would do it, but still focused on that spontaneous fermentation. And I think, I mean, I went to school for microbiology, and it's kind of funny to like be this like micro nerd and then also take and like basically get rid of all control of the micro of your beer. And so, but part of it for me is like being into microbiology is like making a beer with one strain of yeast is like being a rancher. Like you can know all about your breed of cattle, that one strain of yeast, and you have to know all how to manipulate it and whatever. And we don't, in spontaneous fermentation, have that luxury because there's potentially hundreds or thousands of strains that are eventually maybe moving towards a lower number, but it's more like being like a rainforest ecologist, and like the bugs are truly in control, and like we can manipulate it, but for everything you do, there's a reaction in different populations of microbes, and it's just very complicated, and there's a lot less control that you can exert on those populations.
So you were a microbiologist.
Mm-hmm.
You were also a school teacher and taught
Yep.
science before you launched a brewery?
Yeah, so I never worked as a microbiologist. I just went to school for biology and focused on that. And yeah, I went to school to teach high school science, and that's what I did for 5 years before we opened the brewery. So I taught in Commerce City, Colorado, which is sort of if people are not from here, it's like a industrial type town just immediately north of Denver. You drive by it when you drive from the airport. So
There's a big soccer field out there.
there is a big soccer field, yep, and there's a dog food plant that you can smell. a lot of medical marijuana now too. You can usually smell. So yeah.
So is the process then of getting into spontaneous beer and then letting the microbes do their thing a freeing thing, or do you still find yourself really wanting to dig in and find out what's happening within that fermentation process?
Yeah, I don't really.
No,
I don't. I mean, a lot of people ask me like, "Oh, have you ever like sent it to be tested to find out what strains these are? Or have you ever, I don't know, done genomic testing or something?" And I'm kind of interested to hear it, but the process isn't going to change based on knowing that. So it's sort of a not really a great benefit to me, other than just kind of would be cool to know.
I feel like you want to know how different parts of the process affect the final product, but you're not so interested in like really, dialing down what specifically is happening. It's just more about how he can manipulate things. So hopping rates, or
Right.
we did a beer where we added grapefruit peel directly to the cool ship, just stuff like that, where he likes to play. And
Yeah, and I mean, all those things are affecting that microbial population, and I can have a pretty good guess of what different things might do, but it's always going to be like a little bit less known because there's variability in what you're catching, maybe at different times of the year, different nights even, and
What are the parameters that give you some of your favorite results out of those? I mean, is there a temperature? I know the Belgian Lambic brewers certainly have very specific temperature ranges that they brew within. I know American brewers have found different ranges that work for their cultures, and I think that's something that you've talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty important that American brewers find their own way to make this beer in a way that speaks to the American terroir and American cultures, or where we are, not just American, the location of the place that we're in.
Sure.
What is it that works for you? I mean, that's not going to be applicable to everybody because it's different no matter where you are. But
so we are like lambic inspired beers, what we call spontaneous beers, or we brew those only when it's cold out. So there's some variability in this because it's Colorado, so it's always like that week in February it's like 70 degrees, and we don't necessarily stop brewing because of that. But I look for an overnight load that's around freezing-ish, below 40 Fahrenheit probably. And it's mostly just about cooling rate. I'm trying to replicate a Belgian cooling rate. Our cool ship is really nice because it's copper, so it sheds heat really, really well. So we actually can, if it's very cold out, insulate it around the sides with wood, so that is a little bit stopped. But if it's hotter out, we can run it full open, and the copper on the sides of it sheds a lot of heat compared to like stainless. And then it's also...
What is that cooling rate that you're shooting for? A certain amount of time to cool that wort down?
Roughly like 12 to 16 hours.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's longer. Sometimes it may be in the cool ship a little bit longer than that, but that's really the time it takes to get down to cellar temperature or room temperature, which our cellar in the wintertime is rarely above 65. It's usually about 60 degrees. We have 2 electric heaters, and that's it. And if you're opening the window all the time when it's freezing outside, it gets pretty cold.
Yeah.
And so that's part of our location. That's not that would be required, but our barrels are in the cool ship room, and so the barrels are seeing this daily temperature fluctuation as we're using the cool ship, and that's part of... I'm sure that affects the microbes, and that's part of where we are, and that's like part of the terroir essentially of Black Project here. So.
Now, did you do anything in your cool ship room? I know a lot of lambic brewers will christen their cool ships to maybe help their culture along on that. I know you probably captured some of that in your culture before and initially brewed with a captured culture before you started spontaneous, or
no? So
have you ever maintained a culture like that you've then been able to try to help along?
Yeah, so we do like the spontaneous stuff, which is essentially all lambic inspired. And then we have a bunch of Solera vessels, so they're 550-gallon stainless steel tanks. Those were started with lambic-inspired spontaneous barrels, and then we don't empty them all the way. So some of them have been going for 3 years now. So we'll fill them, got them full of wort. When the beer was ready, we'd package 25 to 50%, and then just replace that with wort. And that wort now is cooled in the cool ship year-round, but it's going into this vessel that has a lot of microbes already in it, so it's a little bit. It's not what I would call spontaneous, but it's cool ship caught microbes, so that's the one way we do it. I forget the question now, but
well, that's a curious one. How does the spontaneous culture? And I know there's a lot of time between when you are inoculating these beers, or when they're spontaneously inoculating, and when you actually get to taste them. But how does that culture that you've captured, that's developed on its own, that you have maintained, differ sensory ways from that spontaneous culture? Is there additional variability in that spontaneous culture? Are there bigger highs and lows? What do you perceive as that difference?
Yeah, there's definitely different. There's a lot of the same threads. Like there's definitely a lot of the same stuff that you can taste between the two. I think we always have this sort of like peach candy ring sort of flavor, and I think that's definitely present in both of them.
Yeah.
But the Solera vessels end up being a lot more
peach candy ring. That's your flavor descriptor.
Yeah, it's Sarah. I don't even like those candies, but Sarah told me that's what it tastes like, and it's a peachiness, but it's not like a ripe real peach. It's like this. A component of what peach is, sort of
Sure.
like just a banana runt isn't exactly what a banana tastes like, but it's 3/4 of a banana flavor, and it's kind of like that. It's not a bad thing, but it doesn't taste like a peach beer. It's just got some peachiness to it.
Sure.
And so that's present in both of them. The Solera vessels tend to be like they get ready, and then it doesn't require a lot of blending.
We get a lot of consistency out of those.
Yeah, and the batches still vary batch to batch by a fair amount, but with the lambic-inspired spontaneous stuff, each barrel, even if they were filled from the same batch of the cool ship, each barrel 8 months later ends up being pretty different side by side. You're like, wow, are these even the same beer? And so that really is a lot more about blending. Like blending is super, super, super important for how we make those beers.
We want to balance out acidity and bitterness and all of, all of that.
Yeah. Oh, I remember the question now. So we didn't spray anything in our room, any beer, other than the fact that we ferment in the same room, which obviously is going to, there's definitely a culture in the room, which I think is true of anybody using their cool ship, whether it's in a trailer or it's anywhere. I think when we started the first 3 years, our cool ship was on the roof, and I think that was probably a pretty good example of us getting away as much as we could from any kind of like, the culture is also part of the room. Is there's nothing above those those cool ship vessels but the sky. But now it's, I mean, for sure, like when you have barrels fermenting on the other side of the room, I'm sure that that's influencing the cool ship, and I'm okay with that because those barrels are not mixed culture. They're from the cool ship itself, so it's okay to me. We do have wood slats over the cool ship, and a lot of people think, oh, you put that wood there so you can spray it down, but we didn't. The ceiling is just painted, and so I wasn't sure how it was going to go as far as like condensation. And I was like, I don't think it would be cool to have like condensation dripping off of like latex paint back into the cool ship. And it turns out nothing condenses and drips back at all. But I felt like it'd be better for this to like drip off of raw oak than off of paint and like random electrical conduit and stuff. So we just basically covered it up, but we didn't spray it down with anything. So
sure, Colorado is quite a bit drier of a climate than some of the traditional spots where
and I don't even know how much that, even in Belgium, they're really getting like real condensation. And like, it gets pretty steamy, but it's not that steamy. So
so the neighborhood over the last few years has also continued to change significantly and there's an immense amount of construction, new construction going up all around you down here on Broadway. How has that influenced flavor in any way?
I don't think so. It's like I said, all the barrels are different, so it's really hard to say like, oh, now the whole thing is different. The one real change we had that I think that I noticed was switching from the rooftop stock pots to the interior by the big window copper cool ship is, and I'm not sure, but I think this might be a function chemically of the copper, is we used to get really, really, really bad DMS blowing off during the initial fermentation. Like when we had spontaneous barrels going, you would walk in the brewery and it was just like straight like green corn and like tomato juice. It was like and like funky versions of both of those. That's the first 7 or 8 days of fermentation. It was just like really DMS forward. Pea
soup.
Yeah, just sulfur compound forward, and so copper does a reasonable job of bonding and essentially removing sulfur compounds. And so I don't know if part of that is that the copper is doing that or what it actually could be. Our cooling rate is no different, but we've got a lot less DMS blowing off in the fermentation. It never has made it to the finished beer either way because it always just blows off, and you're aging it so long and it's fermenting for so long. But it's not as noticeable. So it still smells really funky and weird when the fermentation's going on, but it's not cream corn anymore. So for whatever that's worth,
What do you think causes that barrel-to-barrel variation? If you're loading this beer that's all been coming out of the same cool ship, it's all been exposed to the same amount of oxygen, the same amount of ambient microbes, and they're going into steamed neutral barrels. You're the microbiologist. What do you think could be causing some of that long-term difference between these?
Yeah, so this is kind of, I have sort of I don't want to call it a beef, but a disagreement with a lot of people who are interested in studying these beers. Maybe not as much as people who are interested in making them, but a lot of people say that the oak has an influence, and it's microbes in the oak that are responsible for making these beers. And I've done quite a few tests that, to me, these are not published in a journal or whatever, but to me kind of show that. So we've done.
If you'd like to publish them, just let me know. I know a guy.
I don't want to write that much, but so we did some tests like autoclaved glass, and we took directly from the cool ship on the roof and put some of that wort the next morning into autoclaved glass without ever bringing it in the brewery or touching oak, and the high Kreuzen on that flask was within a few hours of the high Kreuzen in the barrels from the same night. So I've had people say you actually can't do spontaneous fermentation without having oak. I don't think that's true. I saw it happen in glass, and honestly, a year later, that beer tasted within the same range of variation of the oak. And so that little flask of beer. And so, to me, it isn't necessarily variation in the barrels themselves. We don't have what's called a horny tank, so we don't mix Yeah, it's a fun name for it. But so a lot of breweries in Belgium will empty the cool ship, and they're usually larger than ours. So they'll empty the cool ship, put it in this big tank, and it sort of mixes everything together, and then they from there fill the barrels.
Right.
And we don't do that, so it's conceivable that the microbes are more on the top of the liquid, or maybe on the bottom, but I would guess the top. And so maybe the first barrels you fill, we empty it from the bottom, so maybe those first ones have a lower or different level of microbial inoculation rate and activity, than the ones that got it from the top. But I think even more so is that part of what makes spontaneous fermentation spontaneous and so special is that the pitching rate, so to speak, is just tremendously low, just really, really, really low. And it's like you couldn't find microbes under a microscope in the morning. Like, it's not like that at all.
Yeah.
And I've indicated to plate out, like, it's probably better to concentrate it and then plate that. I mean, there's microbes in it, obviously. I'm not suggesting it's truly magic, but it's really, really low. And so the lower that rate is with a truly wild mix of strains, with a super low rate, you go into different barrels, you can end up with a difference in microbes just between barrels, even if you were to mix it all together.
Sure.
Just because there's so few cells, and then for some reason there's 2 or 3 more of one cell type or maybe not literally 2 or 3, but
right.
in one barrel, and thus they can dominate. And for some reason the ratio is not quite the same in the next barrel. And so I think that's actually a big part of the variation.
I have a question about that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Welcome to the Sarah podcast.
So would temperature variation from like top to bottom also affect microbes and how they grow? Okay.
Yeah, but I don't think we have that in our room.
I wouldn't say much, but there might be a few degrees.
Could be, yeah. Could be, and I mean different barrels. A lot of our barrels are the same type, but we do have some, American oak, and just some of them have, we have a couple that have internal staves, and so there's different levels of oxygen and stuff coming into the barrel, which is also going to affect what microbes grow. And yeah, it could be temperature variation also, and the ones that maybe are closer to the window getting colder more frequently, and then the ones maybe in the back of the room can maintain their temperature a little better. And that could be it also, but I haven't really noticed like a gradation top to bottom or like front to back in the room. It's really truly much more random. So.
What's your typical time frame? Like, how long does it, from that moment of cool ship inoculation on to producing a beer that you're happy with, that that's attenuated as far as you want it to, and that you're comfortable releasing,
Sure.
After all that microbial activity takes place? What's that time frame for you?
So we fill the barrels. Usually we'll see like what we call active fermentation, which is really going on all the time. It's just at a certain point you reach a critical mass and it looks like active fermentation to a person looking at it. So in other words, Kreuzen coming out of the barrel.
Right.
That usually happens on the 4th day, sometimes a little earlier, but around the 4th day. It has occasionally taken as long as like 6 or 7 days. I think that's more of a function of temperature than like microbial variation. It's just if it's real cold, it's going to take longer.
Yeah.
And so that's 4 or 7 days, and then that sort of winds down by another week or 2 later. Then the beer just seems to be sitting there. It does not taste good, but it's got most of its attenuation really. Like, I mean, probably not. It's not fully attenuated, but it's beer. I mean, to taste it, you're like, this is beer. It's not sour, but it's got alcohol, and the pH is dropped to beer levels, and that's when it's actually, like, to me, safe to drink. I don't really drink it before that. And then I don't really drink it at that phase either because it doesn't taste good, and it's not really a point. But then a few months later, really it's over the next 2 or 3 months you start to develop, and you can sort of see how maybe it's going to happen. And then the first really time it matters to taste the beer is at about 6 months old, which is at that point it still doesn't have acidity to it, and it's not fully attenuated, but it's starting to get a little bit more Brett component going. This tends to be like in the springtime for us, basically. Like if we brewed in the fall, it's now in the spring. So we make a beer called Roswell, which is all single-year-old lambic inspired beer. But we purposefully take it and fruit it very heavily, and so we actually take it at that time of year before the acidity comes around, because we're adding so much fruit. We want to have not that sour of beer to put a bunch of fruit in, And so the re-fermentation on a bunch of fruit tends to even out the attenuation issues and sort of lock in the beer. But most of the beer ends up staying then in the barrel over the summer, and at 10 to 12 months old, at the youngest it would be 8 months old or something at this point, then it starts to have acidity. And it could be that our barrel cellar gets quite a bit warmer in the summer. We don't have heat, but we also don't have air conditioning, and so we have a little swamp cooler, and we try and keep it below 82 or 3, but I mean it's right around 78 or 80 most of the summer, and so that's when I think the acidity comes about, both just by time and also because the temperature helps the bacterial action. And that's when we start to make like our 3-year blends and our like spontaneous fruited blends, other than Roswell, the more traditional type stuff. And those are actually, even our spontaneous fruited blends are a blend of 1, 2, and 3 years. And so, to be quite frank, like not a ton happens between 12-month-old beer and 24-month-old beer and 36-month-old beer.
Yeah.
Definitely like more acidity, some more complexity, but like they're not, you can tell the difference maybe, but it's not like mind-blowingly different. Like, and honestly, a lot of the 3-year stuff by itself, I don't think I would want to sell, because the acidity tends to go up and the flavors tend to get pretty extreme.
Yeah.
We're using at this time pretty much all smaller format stuff, so all standard wine barrels, 60-gallon wine barrels. I think if we started to have larger vessels that were 3 years old, it might be less extreme flavors. But yeah, so then it comes down to blending at about that year point, taking from deciding what's ready to be blended and what is going to be best to go into the blend now, because it's probably not going to get better over the next 2 years, and then the stuff where you're like, wow, this is really good now, but I can tell like with more time this is going to be superb for next year's blend or the year after as that blend. Yeah.
So, I know these are hard things to quantify, but I'm always curious, what is it from a sensory perspective for you as a brewer that would lead you to make that decision? This is going to get better if I let it go for a year, or this is something I need to use now, or this one in particular could be a fantastic component with a few others in this kind of way. From a sensory perspective, do you have ways of defining these things and categorizing them so that they're this or this one's going this way? And what kind of language do you use, within your own head to describe some of this to yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly just thinking about like what the compound is that I'm tasting. So each of these barrels on their own is not usually something that I would sell. We don't really do very much at all single barrel, like this is one barrel and it's like so good we're selling it. Like it's almost always blended. And so thinking about what is it that makes this barrel good or bad, if it's still got quite a bit of bitterness. I mean, we do a couple of different lambic inspired bases, some as low as like 15 IBUs and some as high as 35 IBUs. And some of those higher IBU ones still can have a fair amount of actual bitterness from the hops that fades. And so that's not, you don't want too much of that. And so if it's got good bitterness, but it's not getting kind of fusely or acetic at all, then we probably would leave that. Sometimes we'll get barrels that are like pretty buttery, and I know it's like some good PDO action. Sometimes it's almost, I've never seen a really, really like 100% ropey where it's like snot. PDO caucus can do that. But there's definitely some where it's got a real like viscousness to it that for as dry of a beer it is, it's like very, very creamy, and like it's like an oatmeal stout on your palate or something. And that's bizarre for a beer that's zero Plato almost sometimes. And so those I give more time, because I think first of all you probably don't want to put that with the rest of the beer, but also like those are signs that this could be better. If I start to get kind of like more perfumey aromas or palate like things, I call it like off bug spray. That's something that I think in small amounts actually is really, it sounds weird, but like in small amounts, like it's really good, and it's not something that's going to continue to develop in the bottle.
Yeah.
Because it's oxygen based. It's about Brett and oxygen and maybe acetobacter acting and making acetic acid and these other kind of weird compounds. And so those we try to use if we're going to use them. Obviously, if it's really bad and it's like straight, gross, we dump that. We dump 20% of the beer that goes through the cool ship.
Wow.
Of these beers. So that's, that's always kind of surprising when people are like, oh, we want to start a spontaneous program. Hey, do you ever have to dump it? And I'm like, yeah, 20%. And they're like, oh. And you can just see like the dollar signs like rolling by in the back of their head like, dang, okay. And I'm like, yeah, also we have sometimes 20% evaporation. So in the cool ship, we're losing, 30% of what actually comes out of the kettle never sees a bottle. And a lot of it's just lost to the air. Of course, that's Colorado where it's super dry. But, yeah.
For a brewery that's producing about 250 barrels, that's
right.
a massive percentage.
We're brewing a lot more than that for sure. Sure. So, yeah. And I mean, and also like, we have, a goal maybe of being at 1,000 barrels in a couple of years. And that's maybe close to our end point. But you have to brew like now to be able to do that. Like to be able to do a 3-year blend and be producing at that level 3 years from now, like we need to be brewing a lot of beer this year, and so that's kind of our goal now, is just like get as much into inventory as we can, like keep the tanks full, get all the barrels full. We're hoping, like we were just talking with Ed, our production manager, yesterday or the day before, and talking about sort of our Lambic inspired we call it cool ship season, and he's like, I think we can fill all of our barrels before the end of the year. So we're going to start in like the next couple weeks, and like we're just going to bust it and like try and get done before January 1. And then, it's like, okay, at that point, then if we can do that, then I can start shopping for empty vessels to start brewing more in the spring. And then that's kind of a way to grow. But if you're not filling them all, then there's no point in buying more casks at this point. So,
yeah.
And we don't have any room for those things. Mm-hmm. But if we can fill them all and we're standing around waiting like, oh crap, we could brew more, we'll find a way. We've always found a way to fit more oak somewhere. So, yeah.
It's an interesting rhythm to the brewing process that's, since your focus is, and since you are making only spontaneous beer, or, primarily spontaneous beer, you're only then brewing through those colder times, and you're not brewing, you've got a brew house here that you're not putting anything through?
Yeah, I mean, we do the Solera top-ups in the summer. We do those year-round. But, I mean, honestly, we're moving towards, all of our growth is coming from the Lambic-inspired spontaneous stuff. And, I mean, we actually just kind of talked about this morning, like, if we could really have enough brewing in production, we could probably brew only in the winter.
Wow.
And that would sort of be my goal, is, like, just brew when it's cold, because the Solera vessels, I don't think care as much about the temperature, but we have to top them up. But if we brewed enough that we could get stuff in packaging, get stuff aging only in the winter, that would be really cool. And then the rest of the year would just be blending and packaging, which is like for sure the way Lambic brewers do it. They don't brew it all in the summer. Some of them have some side ventures where they do other kinds of beers, but it would be really cool. We'll see.
So a little bit earlier you mentioned using hops to control some of the microbial activity. What kind of parameters do you play within? Do you age your own hops? Do you buy aged hops? Are you using fresh hops, or sorry, not fresh hops, but typical unaged dried hops? How do you use those hops to control the activity of that culture?
So we are doing in-house aging of hops now, and have been for a while. We've also had to buy bales of aged leaf hops that are quite old, and we're looking for them to test. We're usually using noble-ish type hops, although I'm willing to experiment with some more American-style hops. We have some like Chinook aging and stuff like that. Willamette, which is not far off from maybe noble hops, but so we're aging those. Right now, most of our stuff is using this it's like 2004 or something Bramling Cross, and it's just nasty, like tons of seeds in it, and it was stored warm. We had it tested for alpha acid, and it's various samples all below 0.5, 0.3 alpha acid. Probably was a 6% alpha acid hop when it was fresh. And then I also like, I've gone a couple years now to the Yakima Chief Hop Union Hop and Brew School to talk, but I always learn a lot when I go there. And so there's the Hop Stability Index, like the HSI, that a lot of people look at when they get their homebrew hops, and you can plug that in and figure out how the alpha acid degrades. And so for aged hops, it's HSI, when you test it, can actually be a measure of how well or how poorly the hops have been treated. And so I saw this talk this year where I forget who it was, but it was a Belgian brewery that doesn't make lambic, and they were talking about how they reject hops when they come in. If they're going to be aroma hops, they said the HSI has to be below 0.4 HSI, because that shows that from field to package, the hops have been really treated well. And so she mentioned, I asked her later about lambic hops and aged hops, and she's like, oh yeah, we've tested some of those, and she's like, they're over 1, like 1.0, and like, you know, we have the ones we're using now, we tested, and they're like, you know, 1.47 or something. And so they're like, it's just far and away, like, the hops have been abused, and you have to, essentially. That's what aging hops is. And so I'm starting to look at like using HSI also as a measure of like when the hops are aged enough. You know, if they're only testing at 0.6, like, those are just bad hops. They're not yet aged hops. They're just, you know, they're not really good for anything at that point.
Yeah.
Like, so we have a lot of those hops sitting around where it's like, well, I can't use these as Chinooks anymore, but they're not quite aged yet.
Yeah.
And so that's cool. And yeah, we're controlling those microbes. We're just using a traditional IBU level that's in lambic. It's a range, but it's certainly not 0. And I think that's one thing that's different between lambic producers in Belgium and most people making spontaneous ale in the United States that are emulating that, which is pretty much what's going on. We're not making 0 IBU sour beer, and there's a tremendous amount of 0 or like 2 IBU sour beer.
Yeah.
And so people are like, oh, how do you get sour beer when you're putting 20 IBUs in there? And it's like, well, it's because we give it a year. And people think, I honestly kind of blame some of the initial thoughts people had about aged hops of, oh, well, there's no alpha acid, so there's not going to be any IBUs, so sour beers shouldn't have any IBUs. And it's bitterness from a different source, but my feeling is that it still has a very similar sort of microbial action. So I don't think lactobacillus is really part of our souring process. It's Pediococcus over longer periods of time, which pedio is much more resistant to hops than lacto. And yeah, it's interesting figuring out how many IBUs you're going to get when you just have this bale of old hops. And you can test the alpha acid, and that doesn't give you the true picture. So if we're sitting at 0.3 alpha acid, we'd have to put in like just an absolute ton of hops. And we put in a lot of hops, but we'd have to put in a ton to get 30 IBUs out of it, and like an impractical amount of leaf hop. But it turns out whenever we get a new lot, I basically send the first batch. I put a mid-range known amount of those hops into a beer and send it off. And anybody can do this. This is $30 to get an IBU test on your beer done. So I send it off and say, okay, well, what was the IBU out of the kettle on that beer? And then I can go and essentially make like a virtual alpha acid that you can plug into a Tensith or a Ranger, like Rager, like formula, and figure out what your IBUs sort of are. So that's kind of how we do it to be able to hit that range. Yeah.
And some of the preservative qualities in hops are not connected to that alpha acid alone.
Right.
You know, there are other compounds that.
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. So alpha acids are largely responsible for. They inhibited like the proton pump action of a lot of bacteria, and what we normally talk about is isomerized alpha acids, because non-isomerized alpha acids don't dissolve very well in beer, so it's difficult to get that inhibition without boiling the hops. But it turns out when you age the hops, they oxidize, and oxidized alpha acids do dissolve in beer and most likely have the same sort of proton pump shutdown effect on bacteria to an extent. So like isomerized alpha acids. So
sure.
Yeah.
IBU is a poor shorthand that we use to describe a much more complex process.
Yeah, you're really just looking at how a spectrophotometer sees chemicals, but it's a good measure, I think. And if you're using the same kind of hops, if you're trying to emulate lambic and you're using the same type of hops that are aged the same amount of time, and your beer is testing at the same IBUs as them, it's safe to say you're doing the same thing. And there's a lot of people who are like, oh, you could just totally, well, just what if you did 30 IBUs from non-aged hops? And like we've experimented with that. It's different, not drastically different, but like aged hops have a certain characteristic that makes Goose lambic taste the way it does. Like even though we boil them for 4 hours sometimes, like there's still this like funky, cheesy grassiness that like before we were using aged leaf hops, I feel like our beers were less goozy, so to speak. And now, like as we've been using them more and more, our 3-year blend I think has been moving more and more towards tasting more like the real thing in Belgium. We used to use aged pellets. I don't think you can age pellets adequately. I mean, there's people probably using it, and that's fine, but I don't think you can age them like you can leaves. So,
how important is it for you as a brewer to get something that tastes like Belgian Goose and lambic versus coming up with something that just tastes, like your own terroir?
Oh, sure.
I know that's certainly a philosophical and an aesthetic challenge that brewers in America face.
Yeah, and I mean that's something that we play with that. So like we have a beer, we haven't released it yet, but we have a beer called Lunex. We have released that. So Lunex is actually our 3-year blend with coffee beans. That's a totally different thing. We took a whole bunch of Neo-Mexicanus wet hops this year and essentially packed whiskey barrels full of these hops and then filled it with spontaneous 1-year-old spontaneous beer, and it is like delightful. Like it's one of my favorite beers we've made. And that probably doesn't have really like any sort of like goozy character because it's overwhelmed by this like great Neo-Mexicanus wet hop flavor. So yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, like if we're trying to replicate that, I think you can still have terroir, but like it's just a drastic difference between not having aged hops, not having that characteristic. There's nothing wrong with not having it, but if like our goal is to emulate this, which for a lot of our beers it is, or some of our beers it is, then that's something that should be there. And then the terroir and the difference of what we have here is still part of that. That hop character is probably different, and if we're using aged Colorado-grown Willamette hops, it's going to have that aged hop characteristic, but it's going to be different than someone in Europe using Saaz aged hops. And so that's a large part of why I want to experiment more with Colorado leaf hops and aging those. It's a little difficult to get Colorado hops in the kind of quantity we need. We actually use a fair amount of like hops in a small batch of beer. So multiple pounds.
I think with the method traditional stuff that was going on, I think there was this idea that somehow although it wasn't just us, but this movement would somehow prohibit people from being experimental and would somehow like stifle creativity. And I mean, our tagline, kind of internal tagline, is research and development in spontaneous fermentation. We're not trying all the time to emulate those beers, but this was just a way, a framework for that style of beer.
I think we should probably back up and give folks who may not be up on that a little bit of background. I guess it was last year, a group of spontaneous brewers proposed the designation of method goose to describe beer brewed with that, in that goose tradition, spontaneously, fermented beer with a specific, grist component, cooled in a specific way, inoculated only spontaneously, put into clean barrels, so there wasn't a persistent culture, and a whole set of laundry list of, parameters for that beer. They had some pushback from Horal, the group of traditional lambic brewers in Belgium, who did not like using the term goose, even when it was referenced as the method of goose. And so, earlier this year, they were changed the language around that from method goose to method traditional. There's certainly been some brewers that have opposed the idea of even creating that mark, but I think the overall condition that you have to look at from and the way that it developed was based on a good one. There are still American brewers and respected American brewers who continue to use names, nomenclature like lambic and goose on their beer in a way that is infuriating to those Belgian lambic and goose producers who don't want those American brewers to be using those terms and not simply saying lambic inspired or lambic style, but actually referring to the beer as lambic.
For sure.
And so the whole idea of Method Goose was to come up with a terminology that allows American brewers to differentiate what it is they're doing without stepping on the toes of those Belgian brewers. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way, and now we're in a different kind of language around that. And so that's where we are for those folks that wanted to catch up on that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Method Goose was mostly a product from Jester King, and there was also, to be fair, like the idea was there would also be Method Lambic, so Goose being the 3-year blend of unfruited beer, and then Lambic being essentially the same process, but without the aging component. Just it is the beer made this way, and it doesn't matter how old it is or what you do to it. And so that eventually ended up becoming Method Traditionale and Method Traditionale 3-year blend. So there's 2 crests essentially, which are the certification marks. And I still think, but I'll caveat that, but I think Method Goose is a great name, and from my perspective, I still do not necessarily agree with the idea that it's the same as calling beer goose, because it just means in the method of. It means like I made this like they make goose, but it's in 2 words instead of that. But ultimately, goose is not my word to not be offended by. So, if I was in Herald, then it might be a different story, and maybe I could convince them that this is okay. But, there's language things, and I think that they saw a lot of interest around that, and I think, rightfully so, wanted to protect that. And I hear consistently people saying, oh, well, they make back-sweetened lambic soda stuff, and call it, framboise or whatever, and it's not what a lot of beer nerds are into. But that's theirs to do with what they want, and to me it's like this is their name, and I think Jeff Stuffings from Jester King and I so we actually went to Belgium and met with Horal, he and I, and we were riding the train back to Brussels, and I said, ultimately I think you made Method Goose to be respectful of these guys, and you and I probably don't agree with their logic that Method Goose is not an okay name. But if you made it to be respectful and they feel disrespected by it, you might as well just call it goose. Like they literally said, you might as well just call it goose. Method doesn't have any effect on us, so we're equally upset by either one. It was like, if you're okay with disrespecting them, you might as well just call it goose or American goose or whatever. Which honestly, I would be okay. Again, it's not my term, but I would call it American goose. I would think that would be okay, but certainly would not be for them. So it's not my turn to decide.
This debate is not one that only exists within spontaneous beer.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, you can look at Kolsch, for example.
Sure.
The city of Cologne hasn't, and those brewers haven't seemed to made a major case against brewers around the world brewing Kolsch style ales or calling them Kolsches. But the whole tradition and history of beer, nomenclature and the names we give those beers do tend to be tied to some degree to the place where they're from. And that becomes a style, and that style becomes bigger than a protected term or an appellation in that sense. It's not wine; it is a style. So
I think something kind of key that, at least from my perspective, I don't think that, and maybe Jeff would disagree with this, but I don't think that Method Goose, and I really don't think that Method Traditionale is intended to be a style. And I think a lot of people are missing that point. Because they're like, well, Method Traditionale, that could be traditional. You can make a Method Traditionale Kolsch. I mean, it just means you make it in a traditional sense. So obviously you can do anything in a traditional sense. You can make a traditional method folk song or a traditional method cheese or a traditional method, whatever.
I'm going to start using that on the magazine. We make this magazine with a traditional method
printed. However that is. And so to me, it's never was I thinking, oh, I'm gonna call this beer a Method Traditionale. It's not, to me, it's not a Method Traditionale. It's a 3-year spontaneous blend, and because we make it in a certain way, that bottle will bear the MT3 crest saying this is a 3-year spontaneous blend, and the brewer agrees that they're making this in the traditional way, because you've got people saying 3-year spontaneous blend, and they're making it who knows what, they're pitching yeast in their cool ship, and they're not wrong by calling it that.
Even looking at the guidelines for GABF, I mean, they still call it lambic and goose.
Right. They call it Belgian style lambic.
You can pitch your bugs, and you can call it lambic.
There's nothing wrong with that. But if people are seeking out something that's really a little more based in spontaneous fermentation and in a replication of the traditional process, that's kind of what the idea is. It's supposed to be a mark showing that. It's almost like, what does Trappist mean? And there's people say Trappist style ale, but Orval is a Trappist brewery, and West Vleteren is a Trappist brewery, and West E12 and Orval are not the same beer at all. And so to say it's a Trappist beer, that doesn't tell you what the beer is. It's a certification of who made it and how they made it, and a lot of stuff about that. And this is, I think, supposed to be more like that. So
Trappist sounds more like a independent craft beer seal rather than a style. It is more about the ownership and organization of the company behind it, and not necessarily a product. For sure,
yeah. And I think that, to me, MT is more about the production method than a style in and of itself. I mean, we have people who work for us who, I looked on our menu one day and it said method traditionnel with coffee, and I was like, that's not how I want to use it.
Right.
So we have these little letterboard signs, old school, I don't know what they're called, but the little letters fit in the little slots. And so we're going to 3D print an MT version that can of the crest that can go in there. So we can say spontaneous blend with coffee or spontaneous ale, and then the ones that are MT, we can have that there. But it's not the style of the beer to me,
right?
Because it doesn't make sense. It's traditional what? That doesn't tell you anything about the beer. But having the crest does. If you understand what that crest means, you say, oh, this is a 3-year cool strip blend, and I know they made it following this set of rules. And so that's the idea.
But your goal as a brewer is not to brew only that style or only through that method. Your goal is to make some beers that way, where that fits, and to follow your research and development into whatever channels it might take you.
Yeah, totally. Most of the beer we make isn't going to have the crest. And honestly, it's interesting to hear people say that it stifles creativity, because it's you can make one batch a year of this, or you can make no batches. But if you're going to use it, it's not like we're saying are you going to be an MT brewery or not an MT brewery, and you have to make it all that way or not all that way. I don't think anybody's going to do all that way. And even within that, there's a lot of creativity where MT itself says, it can't be extracts or concentrates for fruit, but it can be any fruit. You can put pineapple in there if you want, or so you can put any amount of fruit in, so it can be very different than a traditional beer in that respect. There's still a lot of creativity. It's just about how you brew the wort, and mostly I think about showing that you're not taking. Some would say that the whole idea is trying to take cachet from the Belgian brewers, but I think that it's maybe more designed as a way of saying, if any credence is coming from the fact that this is made in the Belgian way, at least it really is made in a general sense how they make their beer, versus somebody making their blackberry lambic and it's a 2-week-old beer, and it's just not lambic in any sense of the word, which I've seen. So as I saw a bottle of Eau de Gueuze, which is a very protected term in Belgium, and not even all the lambic brewers make Eau de Gueuze. It has to be essentially very traditional, aged, and not the sweet lambic type stuff. And I saw a brewery in America making Eau de Gueuze, and I'm like, Jesus, that's, you couldn't even, if you're in Europe, it would be illegal to call it that.
Right.
And, whereas Gueuze and lambic are less protected in Europe because of the sweet lambics. If you could probably justify a lot of different methods as being called that, but it's really just about having a transparency in how beers are made, and it's not about a value proposition or no one's going to charge more just because they put the crest on there. That's not the idea. Our most expensive beers, I can probably tell you, are not going to be beers with the crest. Obviously, when you have 3 years of beer in a blend, there's a lot of costs associated with that. But we do other beers that, like kind of like these wine beers. We spend a tremendous amount of money and effort on getting grapes and processing grapes, and these are not MT beers at all. And like those beers also have to be expensive because of what goes into all that processing and the amount of fruit we have to buy. It's not a way to say these are the best beers we make or this is the upper echelon. It's just a way to say transparently, here's how we made it. And I don't have the effort for it, but if somebody wanted to say, oh, this is a way to certify a wine grape hybrid beer, and if there was some controversy about that or people were doing it in a weird way or being unclear about how they made it, I would be happy to say, okay, let's agree on some ways that we could do this, and if we put this crest on there, then people know. I mean, it could get a little out of hand, but yeah.
How many logos do we need to put on bottles before they all look like NASCAR cars?
That's right, for sure. I mean, and that's part of it, I think, but
there's an educational component to this, especially as these beers become more popular, as more breweries are going to start making them. I mean, really the idea was to give consumers a vision into what's going on kind of behind the curtain,
Yeah, it's really about transparency and not about excluding people or whatever. It's a simple way. Instead of saying, hey, we brewed this 60% Pilsner malt and 40% unmalted wheat, and it's aged hops, and it's roughly 20 IBUs, and it's in a cool ship. We didn't pitch any bugs. It went into clean barrels, and it's a blend of 1, 2, and 3 years. It's this age, and like all this stuff. Instead of having to say all that,
sure,
you have a crest. And people who are into knowing what those different things even mean, hopefully will say, I know if it has the crest, then these people certified that they meet all that list of things, and they don't have to say it all in the bottle. And it's not to say that because you don't do those things, it's not as good. It's not about that at all. It's just a way of being transparent.
It's not to say that if you follow those things, the beer's good either.
Doesn't mean it's going to be good at all. I mean, it very well could not be good. And I've had lambic style beers that followed the requirements from both sides of the pond that sometimes were not very tasty. And so it's not about that. It's just it's a transparency method and a shortening of a very involved process, because it's a process that is very different from how other beers are made and very odd. Honestly, so yeah.
So we talked about terroir a little bit with hops, but one of the other ways that you work to bring terroir into your beer is using fruit. Sourcing fruit, whether it's grapes or other fruit from fruit growers here in Colorado, working closely, finding new ways to add very, very significant amounts of those fruits to your beers. Give me a little background on what took you down that fruit beer pathway and what gets you excited about experimenting with it.
Yeah, I mean, people like fruit beers.
Why is that? Why have fruit beers captured beer fans' imagination so much over the last 2 years?
I mean, I think a lot of fruit goes really well with the acidity in beer. I mean, I guess that's probably it. People also just like fruit. I mean, to be quite honest, like most of my favorite beers we made are not fruited. And not that I don't like our fruited beers, but I tend to really like fermentation character, unadulterated, and but I'm also a brewer, and a lot of brewers are also probably that way. I think.
Sure. I was going to say, you do sound like a brewer when you say that. I just want to drink Pilsner.
Right. Yeah, I do just want to drink Pilsner. Yeah. Yes. If I could have 2 styles of beer, it'd be Pilsner and Goose, and I would be set. I don't need fruit in any of that. But people like it a lot, and they can be really good and really mind-blowingly great with just so much fruit flavor, and it is a fun way also to connect to the land and connect to the area. We use a fair amount of local malt. Like I said, we're moving towards using more local hops once they age, and then fruit's just an easy way to do that also.
Well, tell me a little bit about your fruit process. I know you've with your Roswell series of beers, you've been pushing the boundaries, or at least that's what your press releases say.
Sure.
And how fruit is added to beer.
Yeah.
What are some of the processes that you've developed to help to produce better tasting and more compelling beers with fruit?
So I mean, we're very transparent about this, but Roswell, because of when we have to make it, which is early in the spring, before the beer gets that acidity, Roswell is 100% fruit, whole fruit puree. It's not Colorado fruit because there's no Colorado fruit available when we have to make the beer. It's also very difficult to get that amount of fruit in a beer unless you puree the fruit, which is something I would look into, but we don't have a giant warehouse of cold storing fruit from the year before, and we pretty much have to use all the fruit and more that we can get. So Roswell is puree. To me, it's interesting. It's an interesting beer because of the beer, the base beer itself, and the fruit puree is a re-fermentation and a flavoring in that way. It's not part of the terroir necessarily, so we do wine grape beers. We've done it for 3 years now. This year we brought in
6,000 pounds.
6,000 pounds of red grapes. We crushed and destemmed them in house. We did a pretty extended maceration on a lot of them, punching down every day and letting them soak on the skins, and then did a free run to get a little lower acidity and tannin extraction. Also because we don't have a press that's worth a damn, so we do a free run, and it's a little wasteful, but we get 60-ish gallons per 1,000 pounds of essentially grape juice, or sort of like wine. And then we take that and then blend that juice with beer out of the cool ship. So the beer ferments with microbes that it caught in the cool ship, and also with microbes that are naturally present on the grape skins, skins are not there anymore, but they're still in the juice. And so so grape juice wasn't a thing until pretty recently in history, because if you crush grapes, it becomes wine
Right.
on its own. And so we're using essentially that sort of method of kind of a fruit spontaneous fermentation, and that's a different way than we do it for most beers. Normally, so that's essentially wort going into grape juice, and it ferments. They kind of co-ferment. Normally what we do, we do a beer called Cygnus, which is a 3-year spontaneous blend. We did that this year with cherries and apricots and I think Italian plums, and maybe we'll do raspberries also. But
So let me step back there.
Okay,
So
yeah.
with this wine grape beer, you are putting in freshly spontaneously cooled wort into barrels with this grape just juice, not skins.
right.
And because that beer is early in its own process, it's picking up some of the culture from that grape juice, because we all
probably
know,
a lot of it.
we know bacteria
Yeah.
and wild yeasts do exist on this.
There's probably more yeast in the grape juice than there is from the cool ship. Like, grapes have quite a bit of yeast compared to what we're catching from the air. So ultimately, those beers are made from the yeast that was on the grapes. Different kind of spontaneous fermentation, essentially. And it's interesting. So we do Super Cruise, which is essentially 25% juice by volume, and then we do Mock Limit, which is 49% juice by volume. Mock Limit is intentionally still in the bottle, with someone trying to basically be like a red wine, and Super Cruise is more like a grapey sour beer. So,
Can you talk about our beer to champagne?
Yeah, we also did a beer to champagne, which we haven't released yet, and Sarah's been fired up about it for like a year. But we did I'm not a winemaker, but we took Barbera grapes from our friends at Red Fox on the Western Slope, and they crushed them and then immediately ran the juice off, so there wasn't really any color extraction from the skin. A lot of people, and I certainly didn't know this when we started, like, red grapes don't make red juice if it's not on the skin. It's barely red. So we gathered that from them, and we fermented it with half that and half spontaneous wort, almost essentially like a Mock Limit, but Mock Limit's always been a red grape. And then the kind of real interesting thing was we bottled that at about 6 volumes, which is about double what we normally do, and is getting close to champagne. Can sometimes be over 8 volumes, but high, but not so high that we were going to freak out about them all blowing up. And so we then will riddle those and disgorge them in a traditional sort of champagne method, and have a product that is high carb but doesn't have any lees in the bottle.
To emulate
So-
champagne.
Yeah, so to emulate that champagne method of disgorgement, that beer's gonna be called Javelin, and it will probably be ready later.
You can have it in time for New Year's.
No,
No.
that's for sure not gonna
Next
happen.
New Year's.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these beers, it's like, it's partially like we don't have the space or the like ability to do that yet. We just got a riddling rack from Red Fox, so we're gonna start that. But we're looking, hopefully November 2, we're gonna move into a like packaging facility where we'll be able to store and package beer and just random stuff that's taking up space. And so we'll probably be doing that there because we have to move too much stuff around, and you can't really move the riddling rack once you've started on this process and you're collecting the yeast down in the neck of the bottle. If you have to move that rack, you have to start over, basically. It seems like. So we just don't have a space to put it where we know we
Yeah.
don't have to move it. And honestly, more time on the lees and more time in the bottle is just great for champagne, and it's also great for our beer. So, yeah. So that's that. Yeah.
On grape varieties, you mentioned you're not a winemaker, but you've certainly found, and I imagine you've used a range of different grapes. What are some of the different characteristics that your different grape varieties provide for some of your beers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited most probably about, I think it was Cab Franc this year that just like berry jammy and like, I'm certainly not like sommelier, but that one, just smelling and tasting that maceration was my favorite.
I think Colorado does Cab Franc really well, so
Yeah.
we did Cab Franc last year as well. And the grower that we got all our grapes from this year is Colteris, and they have some of, as far as I remember, they have some of the oldest vines on the western slope. I could be wrong about that, but
They grow great stuff. I
Yeah.
mean, so Cab Franc and Cab Sauv were good last year. So this year we did Cab Franc, Cab Sauv, Petit Verdot, which are apparently closely related. And then we also did Merlot and Malbec, which is new for us. The Merlot is great. We got quite a bit of that, 2,000 pounds of that. Just really, just stereotypical red wine to me, like good tannin, but like nice acidity. And the Malbec was just chocolatey and just amazingly almost in a bizarre way. You're just like, whoa, that's like cocoa, and nicely fruity also. And so it's like cherry hot chocolate almost when you just taste it. It wasn't hot, but yeah. I don't know, sure.
these are my favorite beers.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, so yeah, we're doing a bunch of them this year.
Why are they your favorite beers? What is it about the character of that? And I think this is why we're writing about this intersection of grapes and beer.
Yeah.
That it seems like in particular we're watching things move from that raspberry cherry realm, and watching a lot of beer makers and across the spectrum. I mean, everything from Trillium brewing dialed in double IPA with grape
Wow, that sounds
wine grape
awesome.
juice,
Yeah.
to the brewery brewing Vindictive, a Black Tuesday beer with Grenache grape added to this big imperial barrel aged stout. So across the spectrum of styles, not just sour beer, we're seeing a lot of brewers really, really being attracted to grapes. So it just raised that curiosity in me. What is it about that specific flavor that's so exciting to people?
I don't know what I like. That's a great question. I don't know why I like these beers so much. Probably because it's like having your cake and eating it too. You get your beer and your wine in one.
Yeah. I mean, they are familiar. They're
Yeah.
comforting for those of us who also drink wine. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like having a sparkly wine, a little funky wine.
Yeah, it works. And honestly, I mean, I think that winemakers don't talk about this so much, but I mean, having
You're gonna get hate mail.
I think some of them know, but I think when you have some really good red wines, especially, I get good ones. I get flavors that I recognize from sour beer, and I think that there's been some studies that show that Brettanomyces probably plays a lot larger role in fine red wines, especially than people talk about. I think it's it's there. And I mean, you can sulfite your wine if you want, and it's not a natural wine or whatever, but like it's got time in the cask. The sulfite doesn't work forever, and your wine yeast peters out, and Brett is always there. And it's not a boiled product. Like it's not a sanitary product going into the barrel. No matter what they do, it's still a plant, and like Brettanomyces is part of it, and so and that makes it great. And I think that there's definitely some winemakers who would be like, oh, there's no Brett in my wine, and maybe that's true, but I mean, I've seen studies that show some really, really great Bordeaux's and stuff that are not Brett wines by any means, but they are a little bit. And,
Yeah.
You know,
One thing that really struck me last year, so last year we did Cab Franc and Cab Sauv, and maybe now I haven't done this, but I think in the past when I would order one of those at a restaurant, I don't know that I could really tell the difference between the two, but the two beers that we did, the same beer, Super Cruise with Cab Franc and Cab Sauv, tasted completely different, and they started with the same base. And so the flavors that came out of both of those, they were just so distinctive.
yeah, it's interesting being able to have it side by side. And last year those were from two different growers, so there's some component of that. And, but yeah, I mean, it's a great fruit. People like what grapes taste like, so I don't know.
It's very profound.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot more people that eat grapes than eat cherries on the regular. Not that the grapes you get in the grocery store taste like wine grapes at all, but to an extent they do.
And so you then, with your different beers, add grapes in different ways. Not everything is co-fermented, with the culture off of those grapes. You do some post-fermentation additions as well. What do those look like for you?
We don't.
Oh, you don't?
On the wine grapes, we don't. With
Okay.
other fruited beers,
We do kind of the opposite. So we do a beer called Reheat, where we take Mock Limit, which is the 50% grape juice beer, and we leave the lees and fruit in the belly of the barrel. And so there's maybe 2 or 3 gallons in the belly of the barrel, and we put fresh wort into that and let that re-ferment. It's just got just a kiss of grape from that and the cultures that were already present in the barrel. It's the only beer we do that way. And so that's kind of like a second use on grape, but we don't have there's no grape material in the barrel, so it's not like when we do second use on fruit, but we've never actually done a like finished beer plus grapes.
Okay.
It's always been juice, and it's always been using the cultures in the juice combined with coolship cultures. So, and admittedly part of that was probably because the first year what we got was juice from the winery, and it worked great, and that was how it had to be done because we didn't even know how to process. And then it was like, oh crap, now we want to get more, and these guys are not willing to process thousands and thousands of pounds for us, so we have to do it ourselves. And that's been a fun process though, like learning about that, and like I've been reading a ton about what an extended maceration does, and like when you would do it, and how much do you want to press, and all these things, like fun stuff. So yeah.
You mentioned second use fruit, and that's another trend that seems to be taking off, especially in the sour beer world, or the wild and sour beer world. Some of my favorite fruit beers that I've had this year were beers that were aged on second use fruit. It's not only an efficient way for you to get more from all of the work that you do processing that fruit, but it also kind of knocks down some of the more intense flavors in that fruit. What do you get out of those beers that you make?
I mean, I'm a big fan of it. We've done a few beers on tap. I don't think we've done any beers in bottles that are second use only. Kind of an interesting way we're using second use this year is, so our Cherry Cygnus, which is a 3-year spontaneous blend, it's on cherries, and whole cherries. We don't take the pits out. Everything's in there. So we did an extreme amount of fruit. So we did about 400 pounds in a 120 gallon puncheon. We did 3 puncheons, and there's not a lot of beer room left when you've got 400 pounds of cherries in a 100 gallon vessel. So we get 60 70 gallons of beer out of that. That's pretty extremely cherry forward. And then thus far, this is how a lot of Kriek is made in Belgium. And then they would normally blend in base lambic to get it down to the normal level of cherry that they want. And we decided this year, instead of doing that, we're going to do a pull from the first use, which is extremely cherry forward. Then we're going to actually do a second use on it and blend that back with the first use, sort of like double cherry. And then we'll see where we're at there, and then we may blend in more to get it down to a lower level. But we're essentially using the fruit twice, but within the same beer, which I've never actually heard of anybody doing that, but it doesn't mean they haven't. But yeah, that's been kind of cool. It was like an amazing amount of re-fermentation on the second use. Like we had one that was just going for 2 weeks, like all during JBF was just spitting beer all over the place, trying to keep that clean in the barrel room because everybody's coming through, and I was like, yeah, sorry, there's this pink liquid sticky all over this thing is just going like nuts. So obviously there's a lot more to be had and a lot more color. Like it's not nearly as deep red as the first use, but there's more color, and I think it'll be interesting if we can extend our volume that way a little bit. But also I think there's a lot of interesting flavors to be had from the second use that you wouldn't get if you just did a large amount in first use and blended back with base beer. And then
I wonder why that is. Do you think it like breaks down some component of the fruit to like release different flavors?
Oh, sure.
Or, I don't know.
Yeah. And I think biotransformation is a big deal. So you're getting, and winemakers actually know about this. They may not call it that, but certain yeast and bacteria can take components in fruit and actually in hops also, and they can partially metabolize them in such a way that flavor and aroma compounds are released that would not normally have been present. So like in hop compounds, there's some aroma and flavor compounds that are bound to a carbohydrate, and you don't taste them because of that. They're not aromatic because they've got this big heavy sugar essentially bound onto them. They're called glycosides. And so some yeasts have an enzyme called beta-glucosidase, which can break down and then eat that sugar, and then this aroma compound is released. And it's sometimes an aroma compound that you would not otherwise get from those hops, for example. And I think the same thing sort of happens with beer, both on that biochemical level and also just on the yeast is making fruity flavors while fermenting fruit, and so that fruit flavor is amplified. I'm not sure why that would be, but just almost just from a sensory perspective,
Sure.
A fermentation on fruit can sometimes make it be fruitier. I mean, I definitely see that with macerating / fermenting grapes. They can get intensely jammy just as they start to ferment. And the flavor and aroma of it just goes through the roof, and it's like that. How does this taste more strong than it did just as a grape by itself or a cherry by itself? So yeah, I don't know really what it is, but I'm excited for that. And then you've also got, for example, more pits are exposed after it's been fermented once and then racked down, so you're getting more of that almondy sort of flavor, maybe. Also, so
yeah. Where do you guys see yourself in 1 year, and what's the 5-year plan for Black Project?
Yeah, geez, it's like a board meeting up in here right now.
The plan hopefully is by this time next year to be starting build out on another facility somewhere outside the city.
At least looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, really ideally we'd have another facility that would be for production and could hit us to our end goal. Like I said, 1,000 barrels, 1,500 barrels a year. I think that's a doable thing, and that would be 1,000 or 1,500 barrels of almost all lambic-inspired stuff. So we would be sort of all that growth would be in those styles of beers, not in Soleras. We're not going to start more Solera type projects. So those would sort of fade away as we can meet more production with lambic style beer. Maybe that means brewing only in the winter and that sort of thing. Yeah, so I mean, that's right now we're just trying to we're just drowning in empty bottles and all the stuff it takes to run a packaging brewery. We don't have that kind of room here, and it's at this point we're literally inhibited in our production by the amount of crap that's around, and we don't have space for aging bottles, for example. So all of our spontaneous stuff needs to go into bottles and needs to be in bottles for at least 4 months. And so we don't have any place to put that amount of bottles, because this is a years of production of these beers, basically. We need to have many, many crates of bottles just sitting there aging on their sides, and that room doesn't exist here. So we're basically waiting for November 1, so we can move in and start doing that there. And yeah, I mean, end goal being 1,000, 1,500 barrels, that means a lot of oak, and there's not enough room for that here, and it doesn't really make sense to do that in a super urban / what I really mean is expensive setting, you know.
Sure.
Because I mean, the barrels don't care if they're on Broadway where there's a lot of foot traffic. Like, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
But it's expensive per square foot. So yeah, I mean, ultimately
you want to serve beer where the people are.
Yeah, and we're gonna
making beer can
exactly.
Yeah.
The tap room's going to be here for another 5-6 years at least. That's how long our lease is for. More like we'll renew our lease and be here for another 5 years at least. But during that time, we'll definitely have built out a more production-centric space and more of a destination type place that'll be outside of town, but you know, just I don't want to say more farmhousey, but kind of more just a standalone type thing, and just a big building full of barrels. And ideally, we'd have a bigger brew house there also.
And tiny goats.
And what?
Tiny goats.
Tiny goats. Sarah also wants to have goats. So she can't keep a plant alive for more than 3 weeks, but we're going to do this with animals, apparently. Our dogs are still alive, and our cat, brewery cat,
last time I checked.
at Otter the Brewery Cat on Instagram. So that's the kind of the plan, is that facility there. I don't know, our kind of goal is maybe by next year to be doing it. It'd be nice to be able to start having barrels there for next cool ship season, but we're not rushing into it as far as we want to find the right place, because it's going to be kind of this quote-unquote forever home. Especially with leasing in Denver, it's always up in the air. I mean, we're in a very old building here, and I'm looking like one block one way and one block the other way, and there's what used to be very old buildings are now holes in the ground / new buildings going up, and I'm thinking, I don't know how long the landlord's going to want to be a landlord here, and at some point somebody's going to make an offer and say, I want to put an 8-story apartment building there, and it might be something you can't refuse. And obviously we would have time to move out and all this stuff, but like, I don't know when that would happen. But I mean, I don't know if this is a 20-year facility.
Sure.
I don't know if he would commit to that. He certainly probably wouldn't commit to to that. So, and I don't know if we could afford it in 10 years. Like, that's part of the thing too, is rent is only getting more expensive in Denver, and you can only fit so many people in a tap room. So, yeah.
If people want to learn more about Black Project, where do they find you?
blackprojectbeer.com, and at Black Project Beer on Instagram, and at Black Project Beer on Facebook. And we have a Twitter also, but I don't know.
I don't know what the handle is because I don't tweet.
Yeah, it's like at Black Project CO, I think, because Black Project Beer was too long. But Facebook and the website.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me. Once again, this is the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I want to thank James and Sarah from Black Project. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And if you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe. If you enjoy the magazine, subscribe at beerandbrewing.com.
Awesome. Thank you.
If you love brewing as much as we do and are inspired by the work of leading commercial brewers like Mitch Steele of New Realm, Tommy Arthur of Lost Abbey, Matt Brynildson of Firestone Walker, Jeff Stuffings and Avery Swanson of Jester King, Jason Perkins of Allagash, and more, then put one of our 2018 Brewers Retreat events on your calendar. These luxury brewing events at gorgeous resort locations around the country pair great brewers, great food, and intimate camaraderie for a truly unique and unforgettable experience. Learn more at brewersretreat.com. And if you're interested in reaching the thousands of listeners who tune into every episode of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, we'd love to welcome you as a sponsor. For more information, drop an email to info@beerandbrewing.com, and our media sales team will craft a plan that works for you. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.